these habitat types or these particular parts of ecosystems, all those species, they don't all get up and move together at the same rate. Most of them respond very differently to climate breakdown. So you get this complete rearrangement, this complete shattering of ecosystems, this complete remaking of ecosystems. So this whole idea of habitat and ecosystem starts becoming really weird.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore biodiversity conservation and the environment more broadly and interrogate conventional wisdom for the sake of a more robust case for conservation. I'm your host, Andre Mardo. Climate change gets a lot more attention and funding than biodiversity. But as conservation organizations are keen to point out, climate and biodiversity are intimately linked, and there is therefore a good argument for addressing them side by side. Part of that argument is that conserving biodiversity is good for the climate. But an even more obvious link is that climate affects biodiversity. Human beings can adapt rapidly to change through innovation, but nature adapts over evolutionary time, much slower than the predicted changes in climate. And yet the countless books that continue to be produced about climate change are almost exclusively focused on its effects on humankind. Adam Welz, however, just released a highly acclaimed book to fill this gap, The End of Eden. Adam is a writer, photographer, filmmaker, and self-proclaimed conservation theorist with a long-standing interest in the effects of climate change on biodiversity. We interrogate this big subject, and Adam's book in particular, in his second appearance on the podcast. In case you missed it, the last time was episode 11, back in June 2021, when we discussed the subject of problems with performative conservation. In today's discussion, I push back a bit about the degree to which climate change may already have affected biodiversity, considering various other possible factors. But we don't get too caught up in that argument because it would require a separate and detailed discussion on climate models and data. Instead, we focus on the messages Adam has crafted in The End of Eden. I begin by asking him why he chose this particular topic.
I've been interested in the topic of climate change and wild species and natural ecosystems for quite a while. Like a lot of people reading these papers that appear on quite a regular basis, usually the papers are about one species in one place or one habitat or one community in one place. And seeing all these stories that are being put out in the world in a scattershot kind of way, it's like, wow, gosh, climate breakdown, as I prefer to call it, not climate change. I mean, it's really changing things everywhere. All sorts of species all over the place are being affected. They're evolving, they're moving, they're being pushed into extinction.
Mm-hmm.
And then I heard that an editor in New York at a large publisher was quite interested in this idea of climate change in the natural world, and he was putting feelers out. And I then put together a pitch. And what I thought of doing was kind of an overview, like try and sort of pull these scattered stories into some sort of coherent narrative so that people could read about all this stuff in one place and get a sense of how general this phenomenon was, try and sort of bring it into a single narrative, if you like. And I had kind of, I think, maybe grandiose ideas at the beginning of it, of making it kind of encyclopedic, but I very quickly realized that that was never going to happen because there's so much going on and there are like 10,000 stories happening. But I also didn't want it to make this kind of general thing. You occasionally see, the fish in the North Atlantic are moving northward at X number of kilometers per year, as the North Atlantic warms or whatever it is. And those are too abstract. Those kind of generalizations are too abstract for like a lot of people to relate to. They're not sort of stories. So I try to tell, let's say, smaller stories about individual species and individual places, but I try to pick stories that illustrated more widespread phenomena or more widespread reactions to climate breakdown. So what I want to do with the book, or what I wanted to do with the book, and this took a little while of figuring out, is to show people, look, there's this bird in this part of the world, and like climate change is causing temperatures to go up or storms to become more powerful or, whatever. And this is how it's changing this bird's life or prospects or. And now that you've heard the story about this bird in this place, maybe you can understand that the same sort of thing is happening to other birds in other places. So I tell these stories dotted around the world, many of them in North America, some in Southern Africa, Australia, usually places that I know, places that I've been to, species that I've actually seen. And I build a story that really puts the species up front. This is not about scientists and their journey into understanding the species, which is often the conventional way of telling these kinds of stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't seen another book like this. I've seen a couple of smaller books on climate change and the natural world. Both of the books that I can think of at the moment are very much, again, centered on the scientists and on the science and how they're understanding things. And for me, I mean, those books are fine, but for me, they don't get to the heart of trying to get the reader to try and see the world from the perspective of a wild species, which is what I'm trying to do in this book. Like, to really, in a sense, put yourself in the shoes of a bug or a plant or whatever, dealing with this thing that's happening. I've named a couple of scientists in the book, but I tried to stick to only giving names to dead scientists. I felt like I didn't want to turn my current scientists into sort of heroes or whatever. And I only named these scientists in some cases to give you like historical perspective on these things, because what's really, really important in understanding all of what's happening right now in terms of climate breakdown and the natural world is history. And that means like deep evolutionary history can be really, really important. So I go into that with some of these species. Where did they come from? Like, how did they evolve? 10 million years ago, where were they? What were they doing? What did they look like? What have they evolved in today? I want to give people a sense of like deep time. A lot of what matters is shaped by what happened in the evolutionary history of these species.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it also makes people care about species more if they don't just think about, well, here's this bird on this island, in case of the Puerto Rican parrot, which is one of the stories that I tell. But actually, there's this long evolutionary history of these parrots colonizing these islands in the Caribbean over millions of years. And like these birds have come a long way, like everything else has come a long way. I really wanted to make that part of the story.
And I think there's a real fundamental difference between those two kind of categories of books that are sketched out there, because, I mean, I'm of the opinion that climate change is a problem, but it's one that we will probably be able to deal with as a species. I know that's in some circles, that's a bit of a fringe opinion, but that's the way I see it. But when it comes to animals and plants and nature in general, they are not able to adapt in the way that we are unless they have human beings looking after them, like the parrot example that you mentioned in the book, where people are actually sort of building nests for parrots to compensate for environmental conditions. So that's a major difference, right? That human beings, they can adapt in real time, whereas species take evolutionary time to adapt. So this strikes me as a really important topic, and it makes it even more surprising that it has been covered so little.
Well, absolutely. And again, this is one of the central points of the book, is the point you just made. Homo sapiens is super adaptable, and we have these technological abilities. We have these abilities to do all sorts of stuff that other species simply cannot do. And we're probably also intrinsically a pretty generalist species compared to a lot of, other species that are confined essentially to very narrow ecological niches. So climate breakdown is a much bigger deal for a heck of a lot of wild species than it is to us. And I think even though the book focuses very much on the effects of changing climate on species, it also tries to tell stories that indicate that climate breakdown is not the only thing that is impacting wild species. It acts as a force multiplier. It's one more thing on top of things like habitat destruction, pollution, overexploitation, and all of these things that species have to face. So in a lot of cases, it's not acting in isolation, even though what I'm talking about in the book is very much focused on those things. I try to emphasize that it's not acting in isolation. In a lot of the stories that I tell, I talk about a history of habitat destruction that a species might have faced. I'll talk about these other things that are going on. But I want to be able to say to people, even though it seems like, well, let's say, people often say, you'll read these papers, right? People will say the primary threat to species or the primary driver of extinction in the world today is habitat destruction, or the second most important driver of extinction is invasive species. Mm-hmm. What I want to emphasize to people is that climate is in many cases just as important as any of these other drivers, and when you add these other things on top of it, stuff gets really dire for a lot of species. That said, there are some examples in the book that I talk about where it appears, as far as we can tell, that climate change is very much the dominant force pushing certain species into extinction or pushing them into new environments or things like this. There are cases out there, and one of them is a thing that I open with in the first chapter, which is this disappearance of birds from hot, arid areas that has been extremely well documented in Southern California, for example, in the Mojave Desert area, where you've got your average site now in the Mojave Desert is missing about half the bird species that were seen in surveys around a century ago. So there's been a big collapse of bird communities there. We're also seeing it now in Southern Africa, thanks to some really excellent science that's being done mostly by South African scientists here in the Kalahari region, where we're actually seeing in real time how certain birds' breeding success is just nosediving. And we're able to tie that very closely to temperature increases, and we're able to explain why. Essentially because they're getting too hot, they're having to spend too much of their day cooling down, which involves sitting in the shade and panting and not doing anything else, which leaves them too little time to adequately find food for themselves and adequately feed their nestlings. So their breeding success is sort of cratering. So, some really good physiologists have constructed models looking at the birds themselves and how energy moves in and out of individual bird species. And the models correspond well to the theory and what's being observed in the field. And so we can say with a very high degree of confidence, for example, in these particular cases of birds disappearing from hot, arid parts of the world, that this is the dominant factor pushing them out of these areas, the increases in air temperature that are being noted in these places. These are not places that are experiencing habitat destruction. These are not places that are being radically transformed by invasive species. These are not places where people are overhunting. Climate is the best explanation for what's going on. But again, that's not always the same. There's a lot of other places where, species have been pushed into very small ranges because the majority of their habitat has been bulldozed or whatever, and climate change then comes and sort of delivers the final blow, if you like, that pushes them into real trouble.
I wanted to get back to quite a few of the things that you said now, but before I do, and you've already given one kind of general example now, but also just by way of kind of introducing listeners to the book and the way that it's written, can you give one specific example, and perhaps the one that's your favorite or the one that stands out the most or has any special significance?
Geez, that's a hard one because there's so many examples here, interesting examples. But I mean, one of the stories I really like is the story of the Puerto Rico parrot, which is this large green Amazon parrot that used to be very common on Puerto Rico, but over centuries of deforestation was then confined to one very small, really just a few hundred hectares of old growth forest in one part of Puerto Rico. And the reason it was confined to this small area was that Puerto Rican parrots are obligate sort of secondary cavity nesters. They have to nest in holes in trees, essentially, but they are not able to excavate those holes themselves, not like woodpeckers that drill their own holes. And basically, the only place that you find these nice holes that the parrots can nest in is in big, really old trees where, there's been a lot of time has passed for branches to break off and bits to rot out of the tree and create these kind of cavities. Without big old trees, there's nowhere for them to nest. And over the centuries, so much of Puerto Rico's old-growth forest was chopped down that there was really only this one part of the island that still had these old trees with the right kind of holes in it. And that's where the last Puerto Rican parrots ended up. But the climate of this particular part of Puerto Rico is really unsuitable for Puerto Rican parrots. In fact, there were all kinds of diseases, and the nest got too wet. Basically, it's in an area that receives the highest rainfall in Puerto Rico. So the nest got too wet and the nestlings got diseased, and the breeding success of these parrots went downhill. And I use that as a sort of example of how ending up in the wrong microclimate can ultimately wipe you out. And these parrots were only saved due to very expensive and very long-lasting and very interventionist work by a lot of conservationists who built artificial nest cavities for these birds and raised the babies by hand and dealt with all the diseases and things like this. And so there was this incredible amount of work that went into sort of saving these birds. Part of this was raising a whole lot of them in captivity. So they would take eggs out of the nests, the last wild nests, and they would put these eggs in an incubator. And when the eggs hatched, they would raise them, but with a different species of parrot as their foster parents, with Hispaniolan parrots. And this was a good thing. A lot of birds, if you take their eggs away, they will lay another clutch to replace the stolen eggs, as it were. So by taking the eggs away and raising those eggs in captivity, you effectively you can double the output, and that's very useful if there are very few of these birds left. But Hispaniolan parrots speak a different language. And also the foster parents that they were using had also been taken, usually confiscated from people that were trading these birds illegally. So a lot of those Hispaniolan parrots had also been born and sort of raised in captivity. Why this is important is that the captive bred Puerto Rican parrots learned this kind of Hispaniolan parrot kind of language, whereas the real wild Puerto Rican parrots speak a different language that's not only different, but way more complex and seems to convey a lot more meaning about the environment that the birds live in. And, culture and language is super important in parrot species, right? They use all sorts of different calls to communicate all kinds of different things. And so what happened was, this captive breeding allowed the numbers of Puerto Rican parrots to be expanded and go up and create a solid population. But a lot of those parrots were like culturally captive. They didn't necessarily understand the wild parrots. And in fact, often when they released those cage-bred parrots into the last wild population, the captive-bred birds got whacked by predators at much higher rates than the wild-bred birds did, because it seems that they didn't understand the warnings from the other birds, that there was like a red-tailed hawk around or whatever it is, get down or hide away or whatever, fly away. They didn't understand the warnings from the other birds. So, even though the sort of breeding success, the nestling output was much higher in captivity because they could keep these birds away from all the diseases and all of that were afflicting the wild population. By the time they were released into the wild, then they started dying at much higher rates than the wild birds. But anyway, the upshot is that even though the Puerto Rican parrot on paper today is in a much healthier position than it was a few decades ago, there are far more Puerto Rican parrots than there were, a few hundred now versus, a few tens. This hurricane came along, Hurricane Maria, and and essentially, to cut a long story short, killed all of the birds in the wild that still spoke the full wild language of the Puerto Rican parrot. So even though there were backup birds in captivity, there was another free-flying flock established on another part of the island of Puerto Rico. But the short version is where the hurricane hit and where it was at maximum intensity was right in the area where the last wild talking Puerto Rican parrots were, and it killed all of them. And so this hurricane didn't cause the extinction of the Puerto Rican parrot per se, but it caused the extinction of Puerto Rican parrot culture by wiping out the birds that spoke, if you like, the old language and that understood all the behaviors of a wild Puerto Rican parrot. And I mean, that story for me is really impactful because it tells you there's nuance here. You know, often people talk about extinction as a sort of black and white thing. It's like a 1 or a 0. You're either extinct or you aren't. And actually, extinction's not like that. Extinction is a very nuanced thing that exists in all sorts of different phases and in all sorts of different ways.
Some of the pushback that you might get from the skeptics out there, and I guess I share a little bit of this skepticism, although I hate to use that word. But I mean, the overarching question would be, how do we know? So in that case, you mentioned that this Category 5 hurricane was rare and more likely to happen in the case of climate change, right? So that's so they get hurricanes there fairly frequently, but not Category 5 hurricanes. It's an unusually and very strong one. But how do we know that climate change is a factor in that example when there are other factors like the isolation of the population and maybe the forest was more exposed than other parts of forest on the island and that kind of thing? Because in this particular example, I know like the stats for the North Atlantic are that in the past 100 and something years, maybe 140 years or thereabouts, in the North Atlantic, so this is a bit north of Puerto Rico. I don't think it includes Puerto Rico, but sort of in the vicinity, there have been only 3 Category 5 hurricanes. The first of these was in 1935 or thereabouts, and then there was another one in the 50s, another one in the 80s or something like that. So they do happen. And I think in the story, you even mentioned that, you know, this might happen every 100 years on that island, you know, at that sort of time interval, which is a much more frequent time interval than the evolutionary history of the birds. So how do you kind of reconcile those factors? You know, the fact that these storms...
Well, no. So if you look at Puerto Rico and you look at this parrot, and I mean, pretty much the whole of the Caribbean, you know, just about every species in there has to be able to survive hurricanes, right? Hurricanes are like a regular thing, and they've been around for ages. But I make a few different points in this story in the book. If you imagine Puerto Rico before it was deforested, pretty much 90% of the island is naturally forested, let's say. And a big hurricane comes along. Well, even a Category 5 is not big enough. It doesn't cover an area large enough to level all the forest on the island. It's going to level a quarter of the forest on the island or a third of the forest on the island. Puerto Rico is a large enough island that even a really, really big hurricane is not going to flatten all of the forest. And we know from records in the past, from, you know, early colonial explorers records and stuff, that when the first white people rocked up in Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican parrots were really common. And in a lot of habitats, in fact, there are probably at least 1 million birds on the island in the species. You know, some people reckon it's been estimated. So a big hurricane comes along. In the worst case scenario, it takes out a third of the breeding habitat on the island, knocks down all these huge trees that the birds need to nest in, and the trees are gone. It's going to take at least probably 50 years, 80 years, even 100 years for that forest to regrow and mature to the point where you've got these big old sort of gnarly trees with the holes in them again. But that's fine because they've still got 2/3 of the island with old trees in it. They can carry on nesting there. That's no problem. And if these big hurricanes, these really big ones, these Category 5s, only roll around once a century or so, and you're losing, again, in the worst case scenario, a third of your breeding habitat every century, and you've got another century for it to regrow. that's no real threat to the continued existence of the species on the island. But things change. And I mean, the folks I was speaking to, the hurricane scientists, I did speak to a few of these guys, saying, look, the statistical evidence is that hurricanes are not actually becoming more frequent in the Caribbean. But there is data emerging now to indicate that they're becoming stronger. So even though there aren't more hurricanes, it's very, very likely that we're going to see many more category 4s and 5s than we did in the past. And as I point out in the book, a hurricane is not just a hurricane. A category 1 or a 2 hurricane is not going to be strong enough to take out these big old trees. I mean, these trees have evolved to be strong enough to withstand, because those smaller hurricanes are super frequent. That sort of created this evolutionary filter that has like filtered out any tree that can't survive that. And so the point I make in the book is intensity really matters. A category 1 or 2 hurricane has totally different ecological effects than a category 4 or a 5. And the fact that a category 4 and 5s might now be hitting the island more frequently than the generation time or shorter time intervals than the time it takes to grow a nice big old tree full of holes, that really fundamentally changes things for the parrots. And again, of course, we're not only dealing with this fact, but we're also dealing with the fact that the vast majority of old growth forest on Puerto Rico has been cut down. So there is that factor in here. But even if that factor didn't exist, if category 4s and 5s were running over the island every 10 years instead of every 100 years and knocking down, then you do actually move into the zone where you stand a chance of these birds being without any good breeding habitat for decades. And that could result in extinction. So again, I'm trying to point out to people that it's not just a phenomenon that makes a difference. And I also talk about this in my chapter on fire, for example. It's like a fire is not just a fire. There are completely different kinds of fires. And if fires change their form due to climate change or other reasons, they have massively different ecological effects, even if they come at the same frequency than they always have.
So I guess what you're kind of warning about there is that, if category 5 and 4 hurricanes, or if very intense fires that may be less frequent but are more intense, if the frequency of very intense ones increases, then that's going to have an impact. But I think still the question is like, how much? So if it changes,
I'll give you another example. I'll give you.
Okay, let me just to quickly finish the question. So if you're talking about it happening every 10 years instead of every 100 years, then I would agree that's a major issue. But that's not, as far as I understand, what the climate models, even the most extreme ones, are predicting. They're talking about a bit more frequently that you're going to see these intense ones. As far as I understand, the current projections are not for like a 10-fold increase in category 5 hurricanes or
even a doubling is going to change things for a lot of species, and again, I think just as sort of sidebar here, another thing that sort of emerged for me very strongly when I was writing the book, people have this weird idea that influence equals control. Like, if you increase the force or the power of something, you increase your control over whatever that thing is causing. And the thing about climate change is that the more heat trapping gas we put up into the atmosphere, in other words, the more we influence the climate through this, the less control we have over the system, and the less predictable it becomes. And so the more that this goes on, the more these unexpected second order type of effects are going to emerge. The biosphere is way too complicated to model in detail. And yes, there are certain things we can say and we can understand and we can sort of draw simple sort of energy flux models of the atmosphere and say, okay, right, if we add this much CO2, it's going to trap this much thermal energy and it's going to raise temperature at this level of the atmosphere by this many degrees on average. We can do that, and we can forecast, and that can be super accurate on the sort of general level. But when we come down to trying to predict specific impacts in specific places, it gets a lot harder. And again, the more intense this phenomenon becomes, the more gas we use, the less predictable a lot of those things become. We can make rough predictions. Oh well, this and that, North Atlantic conveyor, this ocean current is going to change or shift when we hit this many degrees over whatever. But even those very large scale things we're starting to see now are actually not that easy to predict, because we're seeing certain things happening a heck of a lot earlier than the models predicted, and others, happening a bit later. So that's why I quite like the term global weirding, because as it goes on, the weirder things get. That's where it gets truly kind of scary, honestly, that level of unpredictability that we're putting in. So maybe there isn't going to be another Category 5 hurricane in Puerto Rico for the next 200 years. But if we look at the basic physics of hurricanes, the basic physics of water and air, the more thermal energy we pump into the system, the more intense hurricanes are going to become just in general. And so it's a pretty good bet that we are going to see more Category 5 hurricanes over these areas. And again, there are tons of species in the Caribbean, not just birds, bugs, insects, whatever, lizards, and so on, that can survive Category 1, Category 2, Category 3 hurricanes, barely touch them. They have all kinds of mechanisms and behaviors and things to survive these small hurricanes. They cannot survive Category 5s because they've been too rare in the evolutionary history of these places to have sort of pushed species to evolve to survive them.
So, given the fact that there are always these different factors involved, including in all the examples that you've provided, because climate change already attracts a huge amount of funding in comparison with biodiversity conservation, but that's kind of climate change for people's sake. And I'm just kind of wondering if we might be faced with a similar sort of micro phenomenon in this sphere, where because climate change has such a high profile globally already, that projects or conservation efforts are more likely to be able to attract funding if they can kind of make a climate change argument, when in reality, climate change may or may not be a factor, or even if it is a factor, it might not be the biggest factor. There might be some other management intervention that needs to be made, a more kind of straightforward and concrete one, like controlling an invasive species or something like that. Does it worry you that this sort of power of climate change to attract funding might kind of take away from more kind of on the ground and run-of-the-mill conservation efforts?
Yes and no. Yes, I see a lot of situations where people are going on about climate. I mean, it's like, yes, I do think there's a risk, say, for example, of trying to keep temperature increase under 1 degree to save the species and then forgetting to save the habitat for the species, to put it sort of bluntly or whatever. I can see that sort of thing happening. And there's also these conflicts, right, where people are like, we got to solve climate change, you got to solve climate change. And they're bulldozing thousands of hectares of natural habitat to put up like giant solar farms. They're like killing nature in order to save it. And that's a conflict that I think doesn't get talked about nearly enough, because a lot of people just assume that all the climate change people and all the species conservation people are on the same page, but actually there are conflicts, and they're getting more intense in a lot of places around sort of alternative energy. So yes, I think it is a real danger that we overlook some of these other things by sort of mono-focusing on climate change. However, and this is no part of it, I think there's a heck of a lot of biodiversity conservation people who do not understand the threat that climate change presents to what they're doing. And well, folks, if you don't deal with climate change, all of that habitat is going to be unsuitable for that species. And although this has been written about in the academic literature for probably at least 20 years, it somehow hasn't made it into conservation practice. a lot of people are talking about restoring corridors for climate change, right? We're going to restore this corridor, conserve this corridor between the habitat where these species are now and where we think they're going to be in 50 years' time due to climate change. Well, there's a whole lot of work that shows that a whole lot of species, even if they're provided with a corridor, are simply not going to be able to move along that corridor fast enough to keep up with the projected climate changes. So you're going to have to physically move species if you have a corridor or not, if you're going to want them to survive in some sort of habitat. And again, sort of when I said this, like I said to folks, like from big conservation agencies and things like this, what are your plans for moving species? What are going to be your protocols, your priorities, your system for doing this, for assessing how to move species where? Not a soul has thought about this. Because corridors, they've ticked that corridor box, they've done their job. And I'm like, no, because if you look at the academic work around seed projection by the average fynbos plant, X number of meters per generation, or, whatever it is, which is essentially what determines how fast a plant species is going to be able to move around corridor, right? Is how far can it disperse its seeds from the parent plant. I mean, there's some interesting science that's been done. People have put seeds in wind tunnels and God knows what else to see how far, and plug those into the sort of climate envelope models and how the climate envelopes for those species are projected to shift, and the seeds just don't keep up. And so we face a very real issue that if we do not really start thinking hard about climate change and conservation, that we're going to be ticking all the other boxes. We're going to be dealing with the invasive species and the overhunting and the habitat destruction and the habitat connectivity and all of these things that normally occupy the minds of conservation biologists. If things continue on the current track, you don't have to be a genius to know that we are going to lose a heck of a lot of species. We've got to think about how we integrate climate into what we're doing without getting distracted by it to such a point where we forget to do all the other things, right? I think there's a danger of both. I see both happening at the moment. And I see funders throwing money at anything that has climate onto it and neglecting, let's say, the more traditional aspects of conservation biology. But I see conservation biologists focusing too much on the traditional stuff and not dealing with climate, because climate's hard. It's a really tough one to solve and deal with. And in fact, my little plug here, my next book that I've already started writing is called, the working title at the moment is A Future for Nature. And it's really is about this. It's about delving into the conceptual and the practical aspects of doing conservation in a climate changing era. And I think it's something that a few people are kind of thinking about, but there've been very few real conceptual breakthroughs. I think I've made one, which I will present in this book. I think I've found a piece of the puzzle conceptually, but around the world, I see very few people doing this, with a few exceptions. In the United States, the National Park Service is developing what they call the Resist, Accept, Direct framework for guiding management decisions under climate change, which I think is a really useful step forward. I don't think it's enough, but it's getting there. But in a lot of other places, there's a heck of a lot of conservationists just kind of pretending it isn't really happening, or they sort of acknowledge it in a general sense. They'll talk about it, but when it comes down to the real nuts and bolts of what are we actually going to do here now to conserve these particular species, they're lost.
It's interesting what you said about the corridor idea having not really progressed much, because the last time I was sort of a part of that discussion was about 20 years ago. So I assumed that it had sort of caught on a bit more. But I was always a bit skeptical about the idea of being able to build corridors for species to move. I mean, for one thing, they're going to displace other species, and you have no idea what is going to happen with all these new species interactions along the way, So it's super complex.
Exactly.
But also,
exactly.
but in that case, I mean, how on earth do you manage for that? I mean, the probably the most convincing argument that I've heard is for resilience of ecosystems, to focus on making existing ecosystems as resilient as possible. And that can be something as simple as increasing the size of a protected area, so that it has more of a diversity of habitats or something like that. But I mean, what else can you actually do? What are the, if you're saving not a single species, but an entire ecosystem, with a possible different climate in the future?
Well, I write about this in my book, and the next book, not this one. I write about it in the coming book, and I also said it at this conference and got a sea of blank stares and whatever. But it's like really appreciating what climate breakdown is doing leads you to the conclusion that this idea of conserving defined ecosystems is a non-starter or a waste of time. I'll give you an example. Here in South Africa, especially in the fynbos regions and these hyper-diverse semi-arid regions we have here, right? A whole bunch of ecologists and botanists and so on have spent a lot of time defining different habitat types within, say, we have the fynbos biome, or the succulent karoo areas and what have you. So somebody will say, this is Swartland shale renosterveld. Very specific habitat types, within larger things. So they'll say, okay, we have the area that I live in now is called Hunklip sand fynbos. And Hunklip sand fynbos is defined by the presence of a certain kind of soil, a certain sort of climatic regime. Let's say it gets between this and this rainfall in these months. And here are the key defining species of this, habitat type. You'll see this and this and this plant. Okay. And if you're standing in an area that has this kind of soil, gets this much rain, and you see these 20 plant species in the landscape, this is this kind of fynbos, right? And so we've developed conservation targets in South Africa to say, in order to call a habitat type sufficiently conserved, we must have conserved at least X% of the Hunklip sand fynbos on Earth as defined by this area on this map. Right, fine. And now everybody's going, and it's even coming to legislation, right? If we're trying to achieve these certain targets of these habitat types. So I'm like, listen, folks, let's just put it in a very simple way. As climate breakdown progresses, as the climate starts changing, your 10 or 20 species or whatever you use as the sort of indicator species of this habitat, they're all going to change. Maybe 5 of them are going to go extinct. Maybe 7 of them are going to be have to move out to another habitat, are going to move themselves to another habitat in another climate zone because the climate isn't sufficient for them here. Maybe 3 of them that were very rare now are going to become super abundant. But my basic point is these habitat types or these particular parts of ecosystems, all those species, they don't all get up and move together at the same rate. Most of them respond very differently to climate breakdown. So you get this complete rearrangement, this complete shattering of ecosystems, this complete remaking of ecosystems. So this whole idea of habitat and ecosystem starts becoming really weird, And again, unless you start really appreciating that, you're not going to be able to do conservation in the climate change era. And it goes back to really thinking carefully about what conservation is. At the moment, we're in this position where all sorts of people throw around this word conservation. And you ask them to define conservation, they can't do it. And in fact, when you sort of dig a little deeper, just a little deeper, you find that this guy's idea of conservation is completely different to that one's idea of conservation. And they're actually coming into conflict with each other, and they don't even realize it. I'll give you one example of this whole nature-based solutions thing, right? That's the big in all the international conferences right now. Nature-based solutions. Oh, nature-based solutions for climate change. We must plant trees, right? Simple example. I've written about it in the past. So now all these do-gooders are planting literally billions with a B of trees all over natural habitats that either didn't have trees in them or had very few trees, and certainly didn't have the species of trees that are being planted. So we're getting the conservationists who are doing the nature-based solutions are obliterating habitat for wild species on a truly colossal scale. But they're doing conservation, just like the poor people who are trying to conserve the last grasslands in Africa and the last open areas and trying to prevent them from being planted up by the other conservationists. Everybody's doing conservation, but actually nobody's really defined what they're doing and what their bottom lines are and what their priorities are and what their red lines are. And so it's a mess. But nobody wants to admit that it's a mess, because the minute you admit that it's a mess, then the funding dries up.
So, Adam, let me ask you a couple of sort of not quick fire questions, but each is more or less independent. What about the argument that species go extinct all the time, and some of these species that are going extinct ostensibly from climate-related reasons were on their way out anyway?
That's a very unnuanced way of approaching a very nuanced question. And again, in my coming book, I make an argument against that argument. But even in this book now, I sort of say, that every different species, or every different form of every different species, every subspecies, every race, every, locally distinct population, whatever you want to call them, all of these things are answers to the fundamental problems of life, right? How to survive and how to reproduce, right? Those are the two fundamental problems. And every single taxon or type of life form, whatever, is an answer to those questions, a successful answer to those questions. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. And the interesting thing about wild species is these are answers that have come into existence not because we asked them. In other words, they are answers to a set of questions or a set of challenges that species needed to answer. And we don't know enough even to have asked those questions in the first place, right? We don't face the challenges that these other species face. And so even if we research these other species and try and understand them, maybe we could ask a few of the questions that these species need to answer in order to survive. But we certainly can't answer all of them. So my response to this is species and life forms and taxon, local variants, local populations, all of these things are of value because they are answers to these two fundamental questions. And as things become more uncertain, as life becomes more unpredictable with the acceleration of habitat destruction and climate breakdown, we are going to need as many of these answers as we possibly can get. So this idea that we can just sort of write off species because we thought they were on their way out anyway. Well, first of all, we don't really know that. But this idea that species are kind of disposable is a very shaky idea.
Is there a danger that if you're, and this is sort of thinking about, the effect of climate on biodiversity specifically, the focus of your book, is there a danger that once you've found an example that looks like it has climate relevance, that you'll, have that sort of focus bias and so start finding reasons to include climate into it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of cases where people have, let's say, played up the climate impact on a species in order to get funding to conserve it. And look, that sometimes then translates into them trying to deal with the climate related impacts on that species, which might not be important. But sometimes it is just a little branding exercise in order to get the funding. And then once they've got the funding, they do actually go and spend it on the stuff that's really important. But yes, I do think, if all you got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So it's like there is that sort of danger. But and as I said again before, I see this happening on both sides of the thing. I see people being mono-focused on climate, usually people who are not like actual naturalists, who are not actual conservationists, who can't tell the difference between an oak tree and a pine tree, or a warbler or a cormorant, whatever. Those folks tend to be sort of mono-focused on climate almost as a sort of abstract phenomenon, that just sort of exists in numbers. But as I say, on the other hand, there's the sort of real naturalists, the in-the-field conservationists, the guys who actually know what species they're looking at and all of this kind of stuff. A lot of those folks really have not been thinking hard enough about climate. we're in this difficult position, right, where we've got to focus on the habitat. We've got to focus on the invasive species. We've got to focus on let's say, the traditional stuff. But if we forget climate, all that stuff will be irrelevant. The scale that things are happening in some parts of the world, not everywhere by any means, but I mean, I went to Australia after those devastating bushfires, and it was absolutely mind-blowing. I'm not scared of fire. I've grown up in fire-prone ecosystems in Pretoria. I've seen the Highveld grasslands burn. I've seen the bushveld burn. I live in the fynbos now. I've seen the fynbos burn. I've seen California wildfires, even these big ones. But trust me, the scale and the intensity of those fires in Australia was absolutely mind-blowing. Honestly, I could not have imagined that until I saw it. And I think this is the thing, is like, in some of these places we're seeing these things happen, but in a lot of other places, these changes in ecosystems are far more subtle, and they're happening in like sort of smaller increments, but they're no less consequential. The consequence is still ending up at the same sort of ecosystem, in some places collapse, some places total rearrangement, shattering, reorganization of these systems. If it's lots and lots and lots of little small things happening that people don't notice on a day-to-day basis, it has the same result as that unbelievable mega fire, that takes out 200,000 hectares at a time.
That Australia example is interesting because, I think something which I think conservationists should be careful about is the power of anecdote and the power of experience. So you probably know better than to jump to conclusions, but the average member of the public experiencing something like that'll be imprinted on their mind, well, probably yours as well, but it'll be imprinted even more so on their minds in the context of the media coverage of climate change. And they will be thinking this is climate change, this kind of equals climate change. But it's really important, I think, to separate data and anecdote, right?
Yeah.
So I think you do quite a good job of that in the book, because these are anecdotes, basically. They're stories, but you're also relating them to the data. So that wasn't what the road I was going to go down now, but I just thought it's kind of worth mentioning. It's something I think about a lot. The way in which the media blames every wildfire and every hurricane on climate change, I think, is warping the public perspective of things, and I don't think that's helpful in the long run.
Yeah.
So I'm deviating a bit from the biodiversity discussion.
No, sure. We're in early days of trying to figure out the science of attributing, saying, X, Y, Z. And yes, I think that there is a risk on the one hand of that. But again, on the other hand, there's this other risk of sort of downplaying stuff. We actually had enormous fires here in South Africa a few years ago in the Knysna region, in the southern region, that were incredibly destructive, burnt down an insane amount of houses, took out incredible areas of natural habitat. And these were driven by invasive pine trees coming into large areas of natural habitat and adding enormous fuel for these fires. And so these fires burned in a very, let's say, unnatural way. They were much hotter than they would have been without these invasive pines. Now, I was just speaking to an ecologist in that area the other day and said, oh, well, just, 50 kilometers to the west, we've got an area that's equally invaded by pines. It's equally close to all these houses. It's equally close to all this agriculture that has been in a drought now for a few years. And they're just waiting for a complete repeat of what was known as the Knysna fires, because nobody's done anything about getting rid of these invasive pines in this area. Yes, it's expensive. Yes, it's difficult. But again, the damage that could result is way in excess of what it would cost to get rid of these pine trees. But nobody's doing anything about it, because it's maybe they're assuming that this next fire is going to be natural. So again, it's like, yes, can we say that this hurricane was caused by climate change or is worse with climate change? Well, maybe we can't, but maybe we can say, listen, folks, this kind of thing, if a particularly devastating hurricane comes along, this kind of thing is going to become more common. This is your warning, just like the Knysna fires of a few years ago were a warning to get rid of these pine trees, get rid of the invasive pine. This is a warning. And for me, that's maybe a more useful way of framing it. But again, the mass media doesn't do nuance terribly well. Having worked in it for many years, I know this up front personal. So, and there are very few journalists and writers and filmmakers and photographers who understand the science and who care and who want to know how to identify different species, want to understand ecological science. And that's why, a lot of the reason why we are where we are.
So one last question. There's a sort of a statistic that has been thrown around. I don't know the precise statistic, but let's say a fact rather, that because of increased carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, the planet is actually greening. So while some areas might be getting drier, the planet as a whole is actually putting on tree mass. Is that something positive? Is it a positive outcome of climate change? Or, is it something that we should sort of take heart in, or something that we should be wary of?
Well, in this book that's coming out this month now, The End of Eden, I actually write a whole chapter about that. The chapter is called Fertile Air. And again, it's complicated, but in general, in certain places, it depends where, but actually more trees and trees growing faster can be a really bad thing for a bunch of wild species. And what we're seeing in African savannas and other savannas around the world is that because of the increased levels of carbon dioxide in the air, trees are growing faster. But that means that trees are taking over habitats that for millions of years have been very open grasslands and open savannas that have very few trees are now turning into like dense woodlands. And that's pushing out a ton of species that are adapted to those grasslands. And I use the example of the cheetah, the famous predator, in my chapter. They're being pushed out because of this onrushing woodification, let's say, of the savannas. Also, there's another factor, of course, is trees are darker than grass or desert or these open habitats. So actually having more trees on the planet means that more solar radiation gets turned into thermal energy in the air. And by making the planet's surface darker, we can actually increase the speed at which the atmosphere is heating. So trees are not always, more trees and growing trees faster is not always the great thing that people make it out to be.
Right. And as you suggest, it's not necessarily, I guess people think of forests kind of naturally restoring themselves, but that's not what a lot of it is. A lot of it is savannas changing into woodlands and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and trees marching into the tundra, in the northern latitudes, at an incredible rate in some places. And that's driven both by actual warming of the atmosphere, and so permafrost and frozen soils are becoming a thing of the past, but also due to the increasing levels of carbon dioxide, literally making the air more fertile than it used to be.
Okay, I don't yet have a topic and guest confirmed for the next episode, but there's a possibility that it'll be addressing the topic of mixing activism and science, especially in the field of biodiversity and the environment more broadly. So especially if it is that, I think it's going to be a really interesting issue to explore, and one that I've wanted to explore for quite a while. So I hope you'll join us.